Okay,
Got it.
so today we begin our focus on the actual exegetical process, step number 4, which we call poetic analysis. And again, it's the first major step focusing on the passage. And for the Psalms, this is where we would begin. We wouldn't do the first 3 steps, we would start in step 4. And so, as we look at poetic analysis, again, this is now we're back to the last, what is this session? The last 11 sessions, our focus has been on the building blocks, the key issues and topics that we needed to understand to prepare us for exegeting, studying a poetic text. So, all the things we discussed uh, the parallelism, with structure of poetry, with the characteristics of Hebrew poetry, all the things we talked about with imagery, poetic language, figurative language, the Psalms. We did introduction on the Psalms the last few weeks. All of that is really to prepare us now for getting to the exegetical steps, okay? And so poetic analysis is for poetry the key step. Notice the other ones, step 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, they're all the same at what we did before with epistles and even with narratives. But the poetic analysis, that is the unique step for poetry. Just like in narratives, we had that narrative analysis was that unique step. And so in poetry, it's the poetic analysis step. And for that step, there's 5 components or parts to it that we need to study that are part of this step. The first is we take the poem and we read and reread and make observations. So just like we've done and everything else, right? I talk a lot about this, to read many, many times. Okay, reading the poem, that gets us familiar with it, right? And also, I would say read the poem in different translations. Again, not just to see how the words are translated, but also some translations do a better job matching the emotional tone of the poem. All right, you will see this with some translations. They sort of translate the poetry like epistles, where um, it's just the kind of a literal, sort of a literal translation. I've noticed some translations do a better job of conveying or bringing across the tone of the poem. And so I think looking at different translations, reading from them as you do this first step can be helpful, just to not only show you differences maybe in how they translate particular words, but also look at sort of the tone or the emotion in the different translations. And then finally, once you've done that, after you've read the poem, read it in different translations, again, remember, these poems are short, most of them. Many of the Psalms are, not more than 10 or 11 verses. Now, some are longer, some are shorter, but for the poems that you are going to be studying, you only have 5 or 6 verses. So you can read it many, many times. All right. It's not like when we did John, we had to read the whole book of John. It's like, okay, that takes a while. But to read, if you're studying Psalm 100, there's only 5 verses, or Psalm 13, there's 6 verses. So honestly, reading it many times should be very easy to do, but when you do that, I think reading in other translations also can help you sort of stay engaged and looking for things. And then again, to make sure your reading is active, make observations of the poem, just like with the other thing. What things do you notice? Anything repeated? Is there anything that's confusing or unclear in the poem? Any questions that you have about the poem? Anything that just sticks out to you? Those kinds of things. Spend 10 or 15 minutes, something like that, maybe to just investigate, explore the poem. Maybe the poem as you read it reminds you of another poem. You know, maybe as you're reading Psalm 96, you're thinking, you know, this sounds a lot like Psalm 98. I think I'm going to read Psalm 98 a few times and see what's similar. You know, things like that. Again, you're just observing, just looking for things, noticing things. We're not concluding anything. We're not making a sermon at this point. We're just trying to notice stuff. All right, so do that, just like you did with the stories, just like you did with the epistles. Read your passage to get very familiar with it, okay? And then make observations. And I would say, again, 10 to 15 minutes, you know, and try to make at least 10 observations. You should be able to make more than that. I don't remember if I told you guys, in my first seminary class was hermeneutics, and the professor had us read, do a observation assignment worksheet. And we had to come up with, what did he tell us? This is Ephesians 5:18, so it's just one verse. And he said basically, how many? It was make 40 observations and ask, I think he said 20 questions, and then note, how did he put it? I think he said make like 20 comparisons, or he called them conjectures. But basically we had to come up with 80 things from one passage. So I think 10 to 15 observations is doable, all right? Just really think about your text and what things stick out to you, all right? You don't have to make 40 observations, but you should at least be able to make 10 to 15 observations, okay? So that's first step, all right? Read and observe a poem. The second step is then to identify the setting and the structure of the poem. Okay, so first step, read and observe. I'll just put that here. The first step, again, is to read and observe. The second, your poem. The second is to identify the setting and the structure. Okay, so setting, that is, again, all the elements that we talked about in the setting of a poem before. Do we know the author? Do we know the recipients? What is the situation of the author? Does he mention any places? Does he describe any people? Those kinds of things, okay? The background context of the poem. And again, remember, with the Psalms, each poem has its own background context. Now, like with the book of Proverbs, you'll have a background context of the book. But with the Psalms, each psalm will have its own background context that you need to discover. All right. And a lot of times that information, some information you can find for this in the title. Okay. That we talked about last week. Secondly, what kind of poem is this? You remember, well, I'll talk about it in a second. And then look for the structure of the poem. All right. So again, the background context, this involves these questions. Nothing new here. All right. This is not something we've never talked about before. Okay. We talked about this when we looked at narratives, when we looked at epistles. We discussed this earlier in looking at the poetry. So these are just, what is the background context of the psalm, of the poem that you're looking at? Now, if you're studying a poem within a book, like let's say you're studying Jonah chapter 2 and the poem that Jonah wrote, the background context is in the rest of the book. Okay? So you wouldn't isolate that poem apart from the book because it's part of the book. Or if you're studying the Song of Moses in Exodus, you wouldn't separate the song from the book because the background context is given in the book that we find the poem. All right. So for poems that are within a book, 1 Samuel 2, Hannah's poem, Hannah's prayer. She spoke her prayer in the form of a poem. Now, you wouldn't take that poem and separate it from 1 Samuel 1 or 1 Samuel 3. The background context is given within the book. But for Psalms, those are the only ones where the background context is only within that psalm. The psalm is independent. Does that make sense? No questions there? So when we talk about background context of a poem, there's two cases. One case is if it's a poem in the middle of a book, it's just like every other text. You study that passage in the context and the flow of thought of the book. If it's a poem from a psalm, then you just focus on that psalm. We don't worry about the other psalms. They don't help us with background context. For if you're studying Psalm 100, then Psalm 99 or Psalm 101 will not help you with the background context. Okay? Don't take the context of one poem and put it in another psalm, is the point. They're all independent. So look for the background context of the poem, and that is identify these particular contexts, the geographical, social, etc. for the poem. And again, the title can be very helpful. The poem itself will give some of that information. We'll do an example of this a little bit. So here, let me just mention a few for you here. All right, let's look at a few. All right, I'm going to ask Sid on this one. Sid, go ahead and read the title or the superscription of Psalm 51 here, and then tell us what elements of the background context do you see in this title? All right.
Psalm 51.
Yeah, just read the title, the superscription.
For the choir director, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came to him after he had gone into Bathsheba.
All right, so do we have any idea of the background to this poem?
It was after the adultery of David with Bathsheba. He committed sin against God and the family of Bathsheba.
Yeah, exactly. We know the exact event, don't we, that prompted this psalm. Where do we find this in Scripture? Do you remember about what?
Kings.
2 Samuel 11 and 12.
Yeah, 2 Samuel 11 and 12. So if you're studying this psalm, what do we need to read first or along with it to get the background?
2 Samuel.
Yes, exactly. So here we have a psalm that gives us actually the very specific event that prompted it, which is great, right? We know exactly who wrote this and we know to whom he wrote it, right? Who's the audience of this psalm, by the way? The initial. It was a prayer, right?
Yeah, to God.
God, right? So God's the initial audience. Of course, he wrote it down for the benefit of God's people, but he's speaking directly to God here, and we know exactly why. We have the whole account of what he did, and Nathan confronting him, and then David feeling the conviction, and then he felt the guilt of his sin, and that's when he wrote this psalm. All right, so the title here tells us everything in regards to background context. All right, now notice we have some names here, right? Who's Nathan? Who's Bathsheba? We'd have to, when we talk about what people are mentioned in the poem here, that's not just what's mentioned in the poetry part. You also need to remember the title is also inspired. So there's information in the title that you're going to need to investigate. Again, Nathan, Bathsheba, and we're all familiar with this story. So, we can just go back to 2 Samuel 11 and 12 and get all the background. And that really, really helps in understanding the background context to this particular psalm. So in this case, the superscription, the title of the psalm, the inspired title, gives us a lot of information. All right. Okay, Noor, I'm going to have you read Psalm 52. So we'll go to the next Psalm in the Psalter here. And go ahead and read the title and then do the same thing. What background information do we get from the title of Psalm 52?
Psalm 52. For the choir director, a miskel of David. When Diego, the Edomite, came and told Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. So,
Okay. So what do we have here as far as background context?
David was running away and from Saul, King Saul. Then he gone to Diego the Ahimelech, Edomite. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ahimelech was the priest, right? He went to the family of the priest. And then there's, who's the other person mentioned here?
Saul.
Saul is mentioned.
Yes.
And who else?
Doeg.
Yeah, Doeg. He's a real nice guy. Right? We get, by the way, this whole story, does anyone know where we find this account? Is it written elsewhere?
First Samuel?
Yeah, 1 Samuel. I think it's 1 Samuel 22. Yeah. Remember, David went to the priests at Nob, and they took care of him. And then Saul heard about it. And Saul was angry. How come nobody tells me where David's going? You know he's trying to conspire against me and he's trying to do me harm. And then Doeg, verse 9, the Edomite, said, oh, I saw David, the son of Jesse. He went to Ahimelech. And then the king summoned Ahimelech and all the priests who were there, and he confronts him, saying, you're conspired against me. And Ahimelech said, no, we aren't conspiring against you. And then the king says, you will die. And he orders his guards to kill the priests. And they refuse. But guess what? Verse 18. Doeg the Edomite, I'll kill them. So he murders all the priests and their families. He's a real great guy, right? What an evil man. So this whole section here is the background to this psalm. So again, Psalm 52 connects us to a specific event. And we know exactly the background. So when he's speaking here, why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? Who is he speaking about? Right? We have either Doeg or Saul. Those are our two. We know it's one of those two guys. All right.
He's speaking to Saul.
Could be Saul. You're right. So at least we have a good idea from knowing the background. Then we need to study the rest of the psalm to determine who he's specifically referring to. But again, notice the title here gives us a lot of information, gives us the author, and it tells us the circumstance. When Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and what he told him specifically. Okay, and all that's in 1 Samuel 22. All right, so sometimes these titles are really, really helpful in giving us the background. But again, it reminds us that Scripture is connected, just like when we studied epistles, right? And you're studying, say, the, an epistle to the Thessalonians or whomever that, or the prison epistles, right? When we studied Ephesians together, and we knew the background of that letter because of the book of Acts. And it told us how Paul, when he came to Ephesus and his relationship with the Ephesians, and then meeting with the Ephesian elders, and then Paul was taken captive, put into custody, and went to prison in Caesarea, and then went to prison in Rome, and that's where he wrote to the Ephesians. So we have a lot of background information from another book in the Bible, from the book of Acts in regards to the epistles. Well, the Psalms, sometimes, in this case, Psalm 51, we get the background context from 2 Samuel 11 and 12. Psalm 52, we get the background context from 1 Samuel 22. Okay, let's do one more example. Psalm 46. Psalm 46. Let's do the same thing here. Bridio, I'm going to ask you to, let me see, read the title here for Psalm 46 and tell us what information we can get from the title as far as the background. You need to unmute yourself, brother.
God, the refuge of his people, the choir director, some of sons of Korah, said to Alamoth a song. Sir, I have a question. Include here the big letter, the bold one.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Included this one, the bold one. No. God is the refuge of his people.
No. Yeah, you weren't with us last week, right? We talked about the titles here. This title, no. That title is just the title from the translation. All right. The New American Standard gives a title. This title, we call this a title. Whoops. We call this a title or a superscription. That title is from the author and it's inspired. So, yeah, the God of the refuge of his people, that's just a summary from the New American Standard translators. They summarize the psalm. That's not inspired. That's just their opinion. But the part that I highlighted, that's actually written in by the psalmists, and it gives background to the psalm. Make sure to go back if you didn't look at the video from last week, because that'll be really helpful for this. But what do we see here from this part that's highlighted? What do we learn about? Is there anything we can learn about the background context of this particular psalm?
I'm not familiar with this word Alamoth, sir. Maybe the psalmist son of Korah.
Yeah, at least we know the author, right? It's the Psalm of the Sons of Korah.
Yes, sir.
So we're given that information, right? Not David. We're given the author, the sons of Korah. Remember, those were part of the singers that were appointed by David to lead in the temple, singing in the temple. Yeah, Alamoth, that's we talked about that last week. That's probably some form of instruction that the translators aren't sure exactly what it means. Literally, it could mean to the death. So, because moth is death, muth is death, and al is a preposition too. So, but we're not sure. Now, in this case, the background context, we're only given a little bit in the title. We're told the author. Now, in the psalm, we can kind of get an idea of the possible context just by looking up some clues in the psalm. He mentions wars. He talks about chariots and bows and wars here. And he talks about the nations made an uproar, the kingdoms tottered. He says, cease striving, know that I am God, I'll be exalted among the nations. If you study this psalm, it seems like this was written after God had delivered the people from an enemy army. And further study indicates that it could be during the time of Hezekiah. We won't go into the detail there, but this is just to show you sometimes the title only gives you a little bit, and the rest of the background context you'll need to try to figure out from the psalm. All right. Now, let me show you another example. Psalm 96. Okay, notice here, there is no title. Again, this title is just from the translator, so that's nice, but we ignore that. It's not inerrant, so it's not part of the text. But there is no title from the author. However, if you study and look at what's said in this psalm, there's many, many statements here that match 1 Chronicles 16. And that 1 Chronicles 16, this was a psalm that was given, a psalm of thanksgiving that's contained in 1 Chronicles 16. It was on the day that they brought the ark into the temple, that David had it brought into the temple. And then here's the background. On that day, David assigned Asaph and his relatives to give thanks to the Lord. And here is the poem or the song that he gave them to sing. And as you go through these verses, you will find many, many of the same things are said in 1 Chronicles 16 as we find in Psalm 96. If you do a comparison, you would find a lot of these. Sing to the Lord a new song. Splendor and majesty are ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. That's also in 1 Chronicles 16. There's a lot of similar statements here. So I believe this psalm was written at the time when David brought the ark into the temple. And I base that on how close this psalm is to 1 Chronicles 16. By the way, Psalm 98 also has many of the same statements, and Psalm 99. So I think David, later probably took what he said in 1 Chronicles 16 and made 3 psalms from that particular psalm that he did in 1 Chronicles 16. So if you do your homework, and sometimes there will be other passages that can indicate a connection with the particular psalm you're studying. Sometimes the title will give you that information. Sometimes the content of the psalm will tell you the situation that is going on. And then sometimes you'll see strong similarity between a psalm and another passage in scripture. Okay? So just be good students. Pay attention. As you're studying, looking for it. That's why if you read over and over, you may realize, oh, this sounds similar to something David said before. 1 Chronicles 16. I believe provides the background to this psalm. And it makes sense because remember, Psalm 96 is one of the enthronement psalms where God's rule and reign is the focus. And it makes sense, right? The context would be them bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. And that would be, the Ark was seen as sort of the seat of God and from where he would rule. They knew that God was not confined to one location, but the temple sort of represented God's presence on the earth, his ruling presence on the earth. And so this psalm would totally fit with that occasion of God, the Ark of God being brought into the temple. All right. So all this to say is when you're looking for background context, pay attention to the title of the psalm. You might get some information there. Look to the content of the psalm. You may find clues to the situation in the psalm, or you may find connections of the psalm with other passages. Another example of this, we saw this before, Psalm 18. And you read this title and you go, this title sounds very familiar. And here, thankfully, in this translation, they just give us the cross-reference, 2 Samuel 22, which contains almost exactly the same psalm. So again, we're given the background context. The title connects us to the passage. All right. Now, not every psalm will have this. Some of them, like for example, let's see, Psalm 13. All we're told in Psalm 13 is that in the title is just the author. But by studying the psalm, we are given the situation of the author as he's very overwhelmed, he's discouraged, he's depressed, probably because he is being chased by an enemy. Now, we don't know if it was Saul. We don't know if this was Absalom. We don't know if this was the, remember when he was in Philistia, and he was on the run there. So we don't know the exact event, but we know the general circumstance. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Looking up background context of a particular psalm. All right. So the steps to poetic analysis. First, read. Oh, go ahead, Alan.
Is it possible, Pastor Tim, to know all of the backgrounds with regards to those psalms? Is there always a connection somewhere in the history books?
No, sometimes, like if you're looking at Psalm 150, all right, there's really no background. There's no title. And every line is basically saying, praise the Lord. So we don't know, when this was written specifically. We don't know the event necessarily. It seems like this psalm was written to lead in temple worship, or as direction for those when they would come to the temple to sing praises and how they should do that. But we're not given any particular event that prompted this psalm. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know, there's no people mentioned here. There's one place mentioned here, his sanctuary. Okay. So we aren't given all the details of the background context, but we're given enough that we know the purpose of this psalm. We may not know the occasion. It seems to be related to temple worship. The purpose is how to praise the Lord, specifically what to praise him for and how. In this case, musically. And so in this psalm, that's all we need to know. We don't need to know, was some event, did some specific event prompt this psalm? Probably not. This was probably just a song that came upon the heart of the psalmist in direction from the Holy Spirit that was related to why we should praise God and how. Same with Psalm 149. We're not given a title here, so we don't know exactly who wrote it, but we are given instruction in how to praise and honor the Lord, and that's the focus. Now, there's a little more specifics here in this one than Psalm 150. But again, there's a focus here on God's justice, so we don't know what event may have prompted this, but it's okay. In this case, we don't need to. So some psalms will have a lot of the background context and can answer a lot of these questions regarding here, right? But some psalms only thing we may know is just the content of the psalm itself and its purpose. We may not know the author. We may not know the event. There may be no other people mentioned. There may be no other places mentioned. Okay.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
It's just like You will be able to determine, though, the purpose. Like, what is the point of the psalm? What's the psalmist calling, what's his focus? What's his theme, his purpose? That will be evident in the psalm. But sometimes we won't know exactly what prompted him to write this psalm, or who it even is who wrote it. And that's okay. 134 of the Psalms have no title. 40 something of the Psalms have the author's not known. So that tells us that, in some cases, we don't need to have all the information to still understand what the point of the psalm is or the purpose of it. But we should always do our best to try to uncover as much of the background context as we can, whatever the Lord has provided, for us to be able to do that, because that will help us to better understand the psalm. Okay, good question. Any other questions or comments, thoughts? So, first, read and observe the poem. Second, we're in the step, identify the structure and the setting, okay? And that is done through doing these three things. Looking at the background context, right? That gives us the setting of the poem. And then the type of poem, it's helpful just to, if you remember, oops, a little too far. Again, remember last week, or sorry, was it the week before, I believe. The week before, we talked about the various types of psalms that there are. You can collect psalms in a few categories. And so we talked about praise psalms. We really call it praise and thanksgiving as a category. Lament and imprecatory. Again, remember, imprecatory was sort of a subclass of laments. The songs of ascent, remember those were psalms. We know Psalms 120 to 134, they were written specifically to be sung as the pilgrims were approaching Jerusalem on the 3 annual feast. There are wisdom psalms that are meant to give instruction. There's the enthronement psalms where the focus is on God's sovereign reign. And we just looked at one of those in Psalm 96. The royal psalm, the focus is on the king, and many of the messianic psalms are in this category. The songs of Zion focus on Jerusalem, Zion, the temple, okay? And then the Hallel psalms, those came later. Those were Psalms 113 to 118. They were not originally written as Hallel psalms, but these later were used to sing during the feasts. And Passover is one example of that, okay? All right, so this is how we classified the Psalms. There may be some other categories that you may find as you look at Psalm books introductions, but I think these capture pretty much all the Psalms. You could put them in one of these categories. And really the Hallel is a separate one, but you can put any Psalm you're studying probably into one of these categories, okay? And that's what you want to do. You want to just be able to identify the type. Why is that? Well, because, for example, if we have a lament, there's a certain typical structure to a lament. A lament's going to have it will open with the lament, right? The cry for help, the cry of despair. Then it will usually contain the reason for the lament, right? My enemies have overtaken me, something like that. And then it will have the solution to the lament. And that's a typical structure for a lament psalm. So knowing that it's a lament, you should expect to see this structure. If you don't, if there's something different about it, then that's something that to consider, that maybe, why is there a difference to what we would expect? Okay. Or if you have a wisdom psalm, you're going to expect that psalm is intended to give instruction on a particular topic. Okay, so it's not meant to be like a psalm of praise or thanksgiving or a lament. There isn't that same high level of emotion. The idea is more instructional. I think we looked at Psalm 78. There, the instruction was to parents and how they are to instruct their children. Psalm 90 was an instruction about thinking of the brevity of our lives so that we may live in such a way to take it, to recognize, to redeem the time that we have. Okay. Psalm 1's a wisdom psalm, the path of the righteous or the path of the wicked. Okay. So these are psalms that are intended to give instruction. Or you have, again, if you're looking at a song of ascent, then this is meant to be sung on the way to Jerusalem during the feasts. So there's going to be a focus on family, a focus on Jerusalem or Israel, a focus on celebration, focus on the Lord and the purpose of the feasts. Okay? So being able to identify the psalm type will help guide us and give us a little bit of insight into what the purpose of the psalm is and what it's saying. Okay? So when we're doing identify the setting and structure, we want to look at the background context, identify that. And secondly, we want to identify the type of the psalm. And then finally, we want to identify its structure. Okay, its structure. What do I mean by that? Well, if you remember, long ago, we talked about the author's flow of thought, right? Where the author of a book has several units of thought that he has put together to form a flow of thought. Okay, and in the epistles, each of those thoughts were represented as a paragraph, right? One paragraph, and then a second paragraph, right? So the first paragraph may be introduction. The second paragraph may be a expression of encouragement to the hearers. The third paragraph may begin discussing the topic of the epistle. And so you have these paragraphs all connected together. In poems, in poetry, the author writes in the form of stanzas. Okay, each stanza in a poem represents a unit of thought. And every poem will have at least one stanza, but often they will have a few stanzas. They're kind of like poetic. You could think of them as poetic paragraphs, really. All right, where each is a unit of thought. Together, they are connected to form a stream of thought by the author, which together tells us his theme or purpose. Okay? Just like epistles, in the sense of the idea there. Epistle, right, was a bunch of paragraphs put together, and they're all connected together. And then if you understand each paragraph, you understand the author's overall theme and point to his letter. It's the same with poetry. There's one major theme or focus or purpose for a poem, and that theme or focus is broken up into stanzas. It's just like when we sing songs, right? We have a chorus, but the whole song is about a particular topic, right? It's not just random thoughts about anything. Usually someone's writing a song about some attribute of God, or 4,000 tongues to sing, or my great Redeemer's praise, the glories of my God and King, the triumphs of his grace, my gracious Master, my God. So he's speaking about singing to God, singing about his grace, about his mercy, amazing grace, right? That song is all about the grace of God, particularly in salvation and sanctification and glorification. But it's God's grace all the way through life. So every song, every poem has an overall theme or focus, and that is broken up into sections. All right. So, again, maybe here, let me do this. I don't know if I can do this quickly. Give it a try. Bear with me for one minute here. I'm going to pull up the, try to pull up the lyrics to Amazing Grace. All right. Since I think that's a song we're all fairly familiar with, right? Not inspired, but it's a great song. Classic hymn John Newton wrote. Okay, so here we go. And originally, I think this song had like, oh, I don't know, a number of stanzas to it. All right, so here. Okay, so let's just look at this. Now, this song doesn't have a particular chorus. It just has stanzas, right? Now, are all of these stanzas connected together? What connects them together as you read them here? Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. Now, we don't see grace in this, but we do see it is connected to the theme. In fact, we don't see grace in the last few stanzas. However, let's go back and look at this. What is the focus of this first stanza?
The marvelous grace. Amazing grace.
Yeah, oops. Let's see if I can.
The saving grace.
Yeah, the saving grace of God, right? I once was lost, now it's found. I was blind, now I see. Now the second one, again here, what's the idea? What's the focus?
The reverence of God. The reverence to God.
Okay, reverence. But notice, grace taught my heart to fear. Grace, my fears relieved. That's an interesting twist. God's grace showed me I was a sinner and deserving judgment, and at the same time, his grace was what showed me salvation.
Enabling grace, sir.
What's that?
Enabling grace.
Yeah, maybe we call it, that's a good one. Good, Brio. Yeah, the enabling grace of God. And here in salvation. Now, look at this one. The third stanza. He's not talking about salvation anymore. We might call this what?
Protecting grace.
Yeah, protecting or maybe sustaining grace
Sustaining,
of God.
keeping.
Yeah, keeping, something like that. Okay, and again, this stanza really covers the same idea. Now, grace is not mentioned, but we know at this point in the song, we know it's about God's grace, right? And here again,
assuring grace.
Yeah, pastoring, I think even sustaining could be something like that, right? Again, in life, right? As long as life endures. Okay, now he's talking about what period of life here? He started with salvation, right? The first two stanzas, God's grace and salvation. The second two stanzas, God's grace in life. Now, where are we? What's this stanza focused on? Mortal life shall cease. I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace.
That's during resurrection.
Yeah, he's speaking of the end here, right? When mortal life shall cease. So maybe the, what will we call this grace? God's The promise of God's grace. I don't know. I have to give it some
Security.
Pardon?
Eternal security.
Assurance.
Yeah, the
Or
assurance,
on,
maybe. The
or on
assurance, grace of God. Okay, and this is in death. And then probably we could call this, right, the matchless. Oh man. Matchless. I don't know. In glorious. I don't know. Grace of God in eternity. Something. We could study this more. I just, trying to get, but you see the idea here, right? See how they're all connected?
Yeah.
Notice he begins with salvation, then sanctification, really, right, in life, and then glorification in death and eternity.
Throughout eternity.
See that? So if this was an actual passage of scripture, of course, we know it's not, but just to show by example, poetry in the Bible, this follows the same kind of thing where we have stanzas that are connected together. And in this case, right, we could, obviously this is, the title of the song is God's Amazing Grace. And we could see, stanza 1, in salvation, stanza 2, again in salvation. I think it was, how did we term it? The saving grace of God. The enabling grace of God. Okay, again in salvation. And then we have the next two stanzas. What do we call that first one?
Sustaining.
Or sustaining. Maybe the protecting grace of God and in life. The sustaining grace of God and in life. Okay, this is the assuring grace of God, or we could in death, and then stanza 6.
glorious grace.
The glorious grace of God in eternity, or we could even say enduring, right? We've no less days, but something like that. You get the idea. Okay. So here, these 6 stanzas each represent a specific unit of thought, all centered around this theme of God's amazing grace, his grace in salvation, his grace in life and death and in eternity. And we could almost put these last 2 stanzas together as well, right? They're connected. You see the structure here of this song? All right, it's the same kind of thing in the Psalms. There'll be stanzas that each represent a particular unit of thought, and they're all connected together. All right, and so the question then is, how do we identify that structure? All right, I'm going to need to take, go into some specifics here, all right? And just summary comment, before the exegete can interpret the meaning of a poem, he has to identify its stanzas, okay, the units of thought. We did this with epistles. Remember, we identified each paragraph. So we could try to see each unit of thought and then how they're connected together. We summarized each of those paragraphs, if you remember. All right, well, we want to do something similar here with the psalm, with the poem that we're studying. All right, and so to do that, we have to, there's a few ways that I want to show you and how to do that. Okay. How to identify the structure of the psalm. Again, remember, we're on the step. Okay. The first step in poetic analysis was read and observe the psalm. The second step is to identify the structure and the setting. And that's where we are. Okay. And in doing that, the structure we have is first, we want to, the background context. The second is to the type of poem. And then the third is now this, the structure. That is the outline of the poem or the stanzas. All right. And that's where we're at now. Okay. So how do we identify that structure? Well, just like with the epistles, the place we can start is, well, let's just see, what do the translations give? How do the different translations identify the structure? So for example, if we look at Psalm 3, well, let's see, let's start with Psalm 1. We'll do that one first. Okay. Psalm 1. The structure is pretty straightforward here. We'll start with just looking at, okay, let's consider what does the NASB have? Well, notice the New American Standard uses two ways to show you the stanzas. The first way is, can you see here that number 1 is in bold font and verse 4? Can you guys see that? Here, let me. It's kind of hard to tell maybe, but this number 1, verse 1 is bold font. And then verse 4 is bold font. All right. So the New American Standard uses bold font, but they also notice separate, put a space between the stanzas. You see that there? So in this particular psalm, we have 2 stanzas from the New American Standard. Verses 1 to 3, verses 4 to 6. You guys see that? All right. Kazot, I'm going to ask you, for the ESV here, how many stanzas do we see here? Now, the ESV uses spaces to identify the stanzas. Kazot, how many stanzas do you see in the ESV version here, translation for Psalm 1? Uh-oh, lost him. You still there? Your video and your microphone's muted. Is he protesting?
He's baking. He's baking. Oh, there he is. You cannot hide.
Three stanza, Pastor.
Yeah, okay. What are they?
I'll just turn my 1 and 2, first stanza, 3 and 4, second stanza, 5 and 6, third stanza.
Good. Okay. So the ESV shows it by space, and that's typically what most translations will do, is they'll show it by space. So for example, oops, it's running a little slow here. The New King James, if I can get that to come up here. Oops.
King.
There it is.
Yung butad panakot ahos uban. Nito tutong tibla na ututong kilawin ba. Ahos Bombay.
Okay. All right. This was a little different. Oh, that's because it's Psalm 128. Let's do Psalm 1 here. Okay, Noor. when I get Psalm 1 pulled up.
Yes.
The New King James also uses spaces. So what does the New King James show for stanzas?
Psalm 1, New King James, 1 to 3, and 4 to 6. Sorry. 1 to 3, 4, 5, and 6.
There you go. So 3 stanzas. 1 to 3, and then notice the space, 4 to 5, and then verse 6. Now, I also like to take a look at the NIV. Sometimes that can... And here, all right, Sid, how many do you see here from the NIV?
3 stanzas.
What are they?
Verses 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 5, and the third one is verse 6, similar with the New King James.
Okay, good. All right, and if we were to look, I think the LSB, I'd have to look that up but you can look up on the internet. I believe it's 1 to 3 and then verses 4 to 6. So notice here, we have from these 5 translations, we have 3 different outlines, all right? So sometimes that'll happen where you'll have a difference of opinion. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes you'll have a very similar structure, all right, by the translations. And so you can use that to give you an idea of the stanzas. But sometimes, like here, we've got a few differences. So what do you do in that case? Well, which is it? Well, there's a few other things that we can look at to help give us an idea of the structure. All right. For example, do you see a refrain in the psalm? That often, remember, a refrain is like a chorus. It is a repeated line or repeated verse that comes at the end of a stanza. So if we look at Psalm 46, for example, we notice there is verse 7. Sorry, verse 7, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. And then again, verse 11, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. So that's likely these two are the end of a stanza. All right, so we know verses 8 to 11 are a stanza, and then either 1 to 7 or 4 to 7 are another stanza. So sometimes a refrain can help us to identify the stanza. Another way is look for a change in speaker. In some psalms, you actually have more than one speaker. Psalm 2 is a really good example of this. Alex, can you read this psalm for us, Psalm 2? Just need it.
Okay. The reign of the Lord's anointed. Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. the Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with the rod of iron, you shall shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment, take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him.
Okay, so notice here, the first three verses is the psalmist speaking. Notice in verse 6, it is God speaking. Verse 7 to 9, it is the Son of God speaking. And verses 10 to 12, it's back to the psalmist. So you see this switching. It's almost like a dialogue in this psalm. But each of those identifies a stanza. Notice that's exactly how the New American Standard breaks it up. Verses 1 to 3 is the psalmist. Verses 4 to 6 is focused on Yahweh, and then he speaks in verse 6. Verse 7 to 9 is the Son speaking. And notice that's how the New American Standard made that a stanza. And then verses 10 to 12, the psalmist again is speaking. So we see by either change in speaker or the focus, verses 1 to 3, the focus is the psalmist. And what he has to say, verses 4 to 6, the focus is Yahweh. Verses 7 to 9, the Son speaks there. And then verses 10 to 12, we're back to the psalmist. Okay, so that helps us see the structure in this particular psalm. Now, another thing to look for, sometimes we can see a change in structure or the stanzas by a change in pronouns. We see this in Psalm 23, actually. Notice that primarily the pronouns here, what are they in verses 1 to 3? He. Now, verse 1 is my and I. Okay, so this isn't completely different, but notice he, his. Makes me, leads me, restores my, he guides me. And then notice it's I, you, your. You see that? So verses 1 to 3, the focus is he or his or my or me. Verses 4 to 6, there's a change. It's I, you, your. See that? And notice, again, the New American Standard picks up on that. It has verses 1 to 3, a space, then verses 4 to 6. And it makes sense here. Verses 1 to 3, he's describing how God guides his sheep. And then verses 4 to 6, how he protects and provides for his sheep. Okay? So look for, sometimes there's a change in pronouns. All right, that can be a clue. A change in subject matter or theme. Psalm 1, I think, is a good example of this. Okay, even though we saw a number of change differences between the translations, if we look at this psalm, what's the focus in the first 3 verses? Or should I say, who is the focus in the first 3 verses?
The righteous.
Yeah. How blessed is the man? Which man who doesn't do these things? His delight is in the law. He's like a tree, whatever. Okay, but verses 4 to 6, the wicked. Now, you could separate verse 6 as a summary statement, but I don't think it is. Look, because notice he says the way of the wicked will perish. I think he's summarizing. He does mention the righteous, but the focus here is the wicked. Do you see that? So verses 1 to 3, the focus is the righteous. Verses 4 to 6, the wicked. Okay. Another thing, look for a change in tone. That can sometimes tell you a difference in stanzas. All right, let's have James, are you there? If you are, can you read Psalm 13 here?
Psalm 13, for the choir director, a psalm of David. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, of the sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, for I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him. And my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken. But I have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me.
All right. Notice here, there's a change in tone. Verses 1 to 4 is the lament. So he's discouraged, he's down, he's depressed. But verses 5 and 6, there's hope. So I would see this psalm in 2 stanzas here. 1 to 4, discouraged. 5 and 6, there's hope. Or we could say discouraged, right? And so these are some, oh, sorry, there's a couple more. In some cases, now this is not common, but sometimes that Selah that we talked about before, sometimes that can be used to identify a difference in stanzas. Psalm 46 is a good example of that. Notice, Selah at the end of verse 3. And then, by the way, there's a change in tone. Verses 1 to 3, it talks about excitement and earthquakes and chaos, natural disasters. And then verses 4 to 7, it transitions to this idea of calmness. But notice there's a Selah at the end of verse 7, as well as the refrain. And then the end of verse 11, there's a Selah and then a refrain. So in this case, I think the Selahs do help us to see verses 1 to 3, verses 4 to 6, verses 7 to 9. But also notice the refrain is here and a change in tone. All right, so some cases it's the law, but not always. All right, so don't assume that. And then sometimes we'll have an inclusio. Again, this isn't common inside of a psalm, but sometimes we see it. Notice Psalm 67. Who hasn't read yet? Maybe we'll get Noor. Can you read this one, Psalm 67? Need to unmute yourself.
Psalm 67, a
Yes, sir.
a song. God be gracious to us and bless us, and cause his face to shine upon us, that your way may be known on the earth, your salvation among all the nations. Let the people praise you, O God. Let all the people praise you. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. For you will judge the peoples with uprightness and guide the nations on the earth. Let the people praise you, O God. Let all the people praise you. The earth has yielded its produce. God, our God, bless us. God, bless us, that all the ends of the earth may fear him.
Okay. So here, when we look at this psalm, we would say, well, let's see here. Okay, the New American Standard has 3 stanzas. It looks like they divide them at the Salah. Do you see that? Verse 1, then there's a Salah. Verse 4, a Salah. What does ESV do? ESV has 1 to 3, 4 to 5, 6 to 7. So they don't follow the Salahs. New King James, what do? 1 to 3, 4 to 5. Oops. 1, 2, then a space, 3 and 4, then a space, 5 through 7. So they're all different so far. How about the NIV? 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Okay, so, and they don't even, where's the Salah here? They don't even put the Salah in. Oh my goodness. NIV, this is not good. Salah is part of the text. In any case, they're all different. This one's a hard one, unless you notice something here in this psalm. Notice, let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. And then verse 5, let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Now, that could be a refrain, or it could be an inclusio. I think it's an inclusio because notice here, this idea, verses 1 and 2, God be gracious that your way be made known to us. Verses 6 and 7, the earth has yielded its produce. God, our God, blesses us. So the focus here is on God and God blessing us. But notice verses 3 to 5, the focus is a call for the peoples to praise him. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad, sing for joy, for you were judged. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. I think 3 to 5 is an inclusio, which focuses on the call to the hearers to respond. So I would see this in this way, verses 1 and 2, verses 3 and 4. That's the inclusio, the call to respond. And then verses 5 to 7, 3 to 5 is the inclusio. And 5 to 6 to 7 is the, so 1 and 2 describes request, God to bless us. And then 6 and 7 is a request and a reason. Request and a reason. And then the inclusio in between. You guys see that structure? God be gracious to us and bless us. That's a request. Cause his face to shine upon us. Why? That your way may be known on the earth. Okay, so request, reason. Then look at verse 3. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad. That's a call to respond. And then let the peoples praise you, O God. Well, we've seen that before. Is that a refrain? No, I think it's an inclusio, and it's marking out in the middle of the psalm the call to respond. Because then notice in verse 6, it goes back to the request. Or almost here, it's almost a statement, isn't it? Maybe a request. I'd have to study this a little more. But you see, there is a distinct difference between 3 and 5 and then the beginning and end of this psalm. Now, this leads us to another example of a way to see structure is the grammar. Again, notice verses 1 and 2 is a request and then a reason. Verse 3 to 5 is an imperative, a command. Let praise, let be glad, let praise. You see that? And then verses 6 and 7, it's not a command. In this case, it's indicative. It's a statement with a reason. You guys see that? It's a grammatical difference. This would be indicative. Verses 3 to 5, imperative. Verses 6 and 7, back to indicative. Let me write this down. You guys following me? Any questions? This makes sense? Please ask if it doesn't. There's another example of this in Psalm 99, a change in the grammar or verb tense or verb type. In fact, let me do this. Look at Psalm 99 with me. We see a similar pattern, almost like Psalm 67. Notice something here. A declaration, the Lord reigns, he's enthroned, the Lord is great. And then a command, let them praise your great and awesome name. Okay? Now verse 4, a declaration. The strength of the king loves justice. You've established equity. Verse 5, command. Verse 6, 7, and 8, a declaration. Moses were among his priests. He spoke. You answered them. Verse 9, a command. So Psalm 99 is the same kind of verses 1 to 2. Well, the first part of the stanza is a declaration. Last verse is a command. Verses 4 to 5, same thing. A declaration. And then last verse is a command. Verses 6 through 9, same thing. Declaration. In verses 6 to 8, and then command in verse 9. So I think that this stanza is marked by the command in the last verse of each stanza. Okay, again, notice there's no command in verses 1 and 2 here, but there is in verse 3. So I believe that's the first stanza. Verses 4 and 5, no command in verse 4, but there is a command in verse 5. Second stanza. And then again, verse 6, 7, and 8, no command. Declaration. But verse 9, a command. And, by the way, a refrain. Exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool. So I don't know if this is confusing you. I don't know if it's helping, but I'm just trying to show there's a lot of ways, a lot of clues that can guide and
helping.
What's that, Alan?
It is helping.
Now,
it helps us trace the stanzas.
Yeah, I know I'm throwing a lot of things at you here, but in fact, let me just summarize by switching over to this page here. Okay, hopefully you can see this here. This is a summary of all the things that we just looked at, all right? So I gave you 3, 6, 9, 10, 10 ways. Oh, sorry, I forgot one more, exclamations. If we go back to, let me show you this and then I'll summarize and then we'll be done. This is, okay, if I go back to Psalm 3, remember Psalm 3, there's salahs here, there's spaces, there's a lot of difference of opinion among translations, but I noticed something here that I think helps us to see the structure. Notice the apostrophe, a direct address. Do you guys see it here? Where's the direct address in the psalm? Anybody?
Oh Lord.
Yeah, verse 1, O Lord. Verse 3, but you, O Lord. And then verse
7.
Arise, O Lord. And then he actually says, save me, oh my God. I believe that these can be helpful in maybe showing us the structure here. Verses 1 to 2, verses 3 through 6, and then verses 7 and 8. Okay? And then as we look at this in more detail, I think, notice verses 1 and 2 expresses the lament. My enemies have risen, they've increased. Verses 3 to 6 is the confidence in God. Right? He expresses confidence in God, in God's protection. You see that? And then verse 7 and 8 is sort of this request or beseeching. So he gives a lament. Then he says, God, you are my protection. And then he says, so basically, so God, rise up and protect me. You see that? So we see here that there does seem to be a different topic in each of these stanzas as I laid them out. And I believe that direct address, the apostrophe, helps to show us the beginning of each of those stanzas. Okay? So I've shown you quite a few. Oh, that's not what I wanted. So we see here, this is a summary of all the different ways or clues that we have to identify structure. Start with the translation. And if you get agreement among the translations, then that's a good idea of what to use as a structure. But oftentimes, translations will not agree because some of these psalms, it's hard to figure out. So then there's a number of other ways that you can help you to identify the structure. Change in speaker, change in pronouns, change in subject matter or theme, change in tone, sometimes salah, inclusio, a change in grammar or verb tense or verb type, or as I said, exclamations. Right? These are the many different ways that you can identify the psalm structure. So I would use this list as just sort of a guide. Look for these things as you try to determine the structure of the psalm, okay? These will be in your notes so you can study them in detail. But it's like with anything, guys, practice is what's going to help you. I may have made it seem easy when I just, oh, look at this, look at this, look at that. Well, that's because I've studied the Psalms for a long time. All right, so I'm kind of used to looking for certain things. Now, maybe some of you are too, but maybe some of you are not as comfortable with how do I see the structure in these Psalms? there's a skill to it. And so I just give you, these are the different ways that I use to sort of look for that change in structure. Now, like with Amazing Grace, you know, the theme is the key. You're trying to look for, okay, what do these verses focus on? And is that the same? And so as the next verses, sometimes that's hard to determine. So look for clues. There might be a shift in the grammar. There might be a change in pronouns. There might be a change in tone. Like I said, refrains, apostrophe, salah, but it's not the case every time. So when you see a salah, don't think, oh, there's a paragraph, there's a stanza break. Well, no, not necessarily. Or if you see an apostrophe, oh, look, there's, oh, my soul. It doesn't mean it's going to be a new paragraph. It's just sometimes it could. So that's the challenge here, is there's an art to this. And you'll get more, as you get more experience studying the Psalms, you'll be more familiar and you'll be able to see it more quickly. But at the beginning, it might be a little bit of a challenge. So if you're not sure, you know, just start with your translation and go from there. And you just got to keep practicing. There are some helpful resources. drbarrick.org, I showed you, you know, that web, he summarizes each of the Psalms. You can look there. Sometimes he has some help on the different stanzas. In fact, we can look one up. Let's see what, I'm going to take a risk here. He might disagree with me on one of them, but we're just going to try. We're going to take a look at, let's see, let's do Psalm 3, the one I just did. So I hope my mentor, I hope I'm right here. Taking a chance, guys. I don't know what he said for this Psalm. Let's see. All right, so let me show this to you. So I'm not going to hide anything from you. I'm going to let you see it when I see it. So will I be ashamed or not? Okay, so this is drbarrick.org. Let's go to Psalm 3, the notes. See what he put. All right, so here, notice, by the way, Dr. Barrick tries to identify, notice, he starts with looking at the setting of this psalm. All right, and notice he's found some connections to certain passages in 2 Samuel. All right, so then here he gives a few comments and notes. He talks about Salah, because this is the first time Salah is used, so he gives some instruction there. He gives an idea of the type of psalm. He calls this a military psalm because of the references to that. Then he goes through, gets some insights on the salvation theme within the psalm. Okay, here's his outline. 1 to 2, 3 to 6, and then 7, and then 8. Let's see, what did I put? 1 to 2, 3 to 6. Hallelujah. Pastor Barrick, I agree with the master. Ha! Phew. Okay. But notice, I mean, he does separate out the superscription, of course, right? That's the title. The lament, verses 1 and 2. Then the trust or confidence in God, verses 3 to 6. And then the prayer for deliverance. He separates out a summary. I would just include that with the prayer. But basically, so Dr. Barrick here shows as well. So he's a good resource as well. But do the work first yourself. All right, don't just run to Dr. Barrick, or, you know, MacArthur Study Bible will have outlines. There's also a helpful one by Zemek, Dr. Zemek. He did a summary of all the Psalms, outlines of all the Psalms. There's some good resources out there that I'll show you later. But right now, try to do this on your own. If you, like we just did, I didn't consult any resources. Right? We just did it on the fly, really. And I just noticed, okay, Psalm 3 seems to have these structural markers. And that's exactly what, you know, Old Testament scholar Dr. Barrett came up with. So that's just confirming. But if I do the study myself, I'm going to remember it better. I'm going to have stronger conviction when I teach it. And it's just all around. It's better if you discover rather than just someone show you. Right? And we've talked about this before. So, all right, you guys have had enough. I can tell. How do you say makalibug? Makalibug? Is that right?
Makalibog.
Makalibug.
Makalibog.
So I'll give you time to think about it. Hopefully it's not ambut, right? Hopefully this will help you a little bit. Well, next week, Lord willing, we will practice. So what I'd like you to do this week is read through Psalm 128. Try to do these first steps that we talked about for Psalm 128, okay? So read through it, make observations, because then we're going to do that together. And then identify the setting and structure, okay, of the poem, just like I showed you in the notes. So I'll try to have the notes ready for you tomorrow. And then practice on Psalm 128. We'll come back together next week and go through that with one another. And then I'll show you the rest of the poetic analysis steps, okay? All right. Any last comment? Anyone want to do a lament? Anyone have a lament psalm for us after that session? How long, oh Lord, will he talk about psalm structure? How long must I endure? But any comments or questions?
Pastor Tim, as I check Canvas, I cannot find the preaching assignment on Psalms and Proverbs.
Oh, okay. Well, if you go to, let's see, do I have that? All right. You talking about for your assigned passage?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Okay, so let's go to Canvas. This is TMAI. Notice TMAI in structure.com. So it's the module 3 Canvas. Log in. My computer may take a minute here. Okay, and then let's see. This is our class, Preaching 3. All right, so this is the front page, the home page, right? And what's the key link? I even made it bigger for you guys.
Download all.
Okay, so go there. Now I should have posted this. Okay, so, and then the first thing is the schedule and assign passages. So let's see, it looks like I did post it. So just hit the download, or actually let's do it here. So hit download. Let me see if it's, okay, here's the schedule. And at the next page, here's your assigned passages. So it is on Canvas. So for you,
I'm looking at different folder. I look at the boxes.
oh, yeah, this is above the boxes. So notice, Sid, your Psalm 8, Proverbs 2, 1-8. Those are your two passages. But yeah, if you hear, these are all, each box here is each session. All right. So today, when I finish I'll upload stuff. So that'll be session 12 today. But at the top of this, and that's why I put it in a bigger font, just so you might see it better. This is where we'll have the schedule and your assigned passages. All right.
It was just behind my nose, Pastor Tim. I was looking on different place.
No problem. But it's important. So thanks for asking.
Sir, I have also a question, sir.
Yes, sir.
I cannot see the recorded video, sir. Where we can find that? Only the hard copy.
They're also here on that. So you log into Canvas. Okay, and you'll see this page with the logo here, Expositors Academy. And then just go to this link to download all course files in the course syllabus. All right, so that's where we just were. And then this has everything. So each session has the notes for that session. It has the assignment, if I gave you one for that week. And it has the videos. Whoops. So I accidentally hit one. So here you go. I just hit, this is session 3.1. So this is our first session.
1 Timothy 3:16.
Oh, and there's that
So
goofy guy. All right.
Hebrew poetry is not just confined to the Old Testament.
Yeah, whatever he said. Okay. So there you go.
Thank you, sir. Only the hard copy I have seen, not the recorded video.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
They're all here. And the assignments. And then you can also get the assignments directly if you go to the assignment page, and they're all here. The reading assignments, the written assignments, which are starting now, by the way. Next week, you'll have the setting and structure of your psalm that you're going to need to do. Okay. So far, all the assignments have been reading. But now we're going to start the written ones. Okay. But you can also, like I said, you can also get those assignments from here. So for example, did I put in the, yeah, I already put in the setting and structure assignment for you. But so for example, you can pull it up there if you want. But that's not going to be due. We need to finish discussion on setting and structure before you have to do that assignment. But if you wanted to do, you know, the reading assignment here from assignment 3.6, you can just download it here or read it directly when you're online. Here it is. Okay. So, and then when you finish, then you can go to, as we've been doing for all these things, go to the assignments and then just, you can pick it out here, assignment 6. I should change those to, and then you can just, when you submit the assignment, right, there's submit box, start assignment, right, and then just note that you finished it. All right. Okay, hopefully that answers. Any other questions, either about what we talked about today, about Canvas assignments? Makalibog.
Super makalibog. Pastor Tim, when you're talking about the lament psalms, usually at the end, it will give you the intent or the purpose or the encouragement.
Yeah, normally with laments, you'll have the lament and then often the reason for the lament and then the sort of the response. Sometimes there'll be lament, reason, and then more lament and then response. But usually at the end, there's some sort of, the psalmist basically tells himself what to do to respond to that lament.
Resolution.
Resolution, yeah.
Okay, Pastor Tim, thank you.
There's 2 or 3 psalms where there's no resolution. At least none that is clearly evident in the psalm. But there are hints. Even in those psalms, there are hints as to the resolution. But typically, yeah, laments will have a lament, the reason for it, and then the resolution. Okay. So Psalm 13, some of you have that psalm that follows that pattern. Lament, reason, resolution. Good. Any other questions? Okay, well, this session was dedicated to our brother Kazot for his birthday. So for your birthday, we talked about the setting and structure of Psalms. What an amazing gift. Super makalibok. All right, brothers. It's good to see you. Let me see. Alex, do you mind closing us in prayer?
Okay, Pastor.
Thank you.
Let's all pray. Let's all pray. Heavenly Father, once again, we are so grateful of what